Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video I'm going to show you how to write something called a crab canon. So what on earth is a crab canon? Well, we know about traditional canon when one voice sets off and then a second voice comes in a few beats later and either copies the music exactly or copies it exactly at a transposed pitch or something like that. A crab canon is great fun because what happens in a crab canon is this. One voice starts going forwards in the way that you might expect it to, and then another voice does exactly the same music but works it backwards from the end. So you've got one line going from the beginning, you've got another line at the end, and they kind of go like this until they kind of meet back at the beginning and the end. So that's how a crab canon works. Writing a crab canon can be an interesting challenge. So we'll see what happens when we try to put one together here. But I'm going to show you how I go about writing a crab canon. You might want to try it a different way, but I think this is the best way to deal with a crab canon. Otherwise, you can end up in a very big mess quite quickly. Take it from me. But there are quite a few examples of crab canon out there, going all the way back to composers like Maschau, who wrote a little piece called My End is My Beginning, where you've got crab canon going on. But it's a good fun thing to try and do, even if it can be just a little bit frustrating. Anyway, bear with me while we try to unfold a crab canon. Now, what I suggest you do with this is just sort of think about dealing with the first half of it and then thinking, okay, if I can then get the first half into one part and then I can use that half coming backwards in the other part until we meet in the middle, then we can see where we go from there. Okay, now, if I start here and I do something, I don't know, let's have a little idea going here. It's quite fun to do this, but it's also a little bit awkward because you've got to think, how's this going to work coming the other way when that happens? And what are the kind of harmonic implications of this? So I've got the first bar there, the first measure going forwards in the upper part. Let's map that onto the lower part coming backwards from the end. I know this sounds like a fairly mad idea, but this is how a crab canon works. So you see what I've done there? This part at the end here, that's the first note that becomes the last note. Penultimate note was the second note. Next note back was the third note. So you just map it back as you go. Now then, okay, the trick is about this is trying to write it in such a way that it's all going to kind of come out on the wash harmonically. So the hardest bit is yet to come, but so far so good. And at the same time, you've got to write something that seems to be a reasonable melodic line. It's got a little bit of melodic and rhythmic interest to it. There's some shape, some direction for it to sound like a piece of music rather than a piece of maths that you've done on paper. If you end up with something that kind of sounds mathematical rather than musical at first, do not be surprised for a first attempt at a crab canon. Okay, now then, let's bat on. If I do this, I'm going to have a bit more movement in this second measure, the second bar, just to make it more interesting and give it a little bit of rhythmic character. So if we do something like that, well, that's given us a second bar. Now what I've got to do is to work that backwards. So if I just put that second bar going backwards here, you can see how this relates to bar 2, hopefully. So there we go. Okay, so if you look at this bar now, you can see it's this bar going backwards. Okay, and you know, what's it sounding like? you can see what I'm trying to design here. A bit of a balance of conjunct and disjunct movement, something that's got enough interest rhythmically. It's kind of going somewhere melodically. So this is the idea. And then how does that work as a sort of bass line when we come down to the end? Well, this is what it's doing so far. So that seems to work as a bass line. I can see some potential harmony going in there. And it also sounds melodic because it's got a sound effective melodically going backwards as well as forwards. You can see what some of the challenges might be here. Okay, well, we're on a roll. So let's keep going. And I'm just going to keep it relatively busy for a while. So we've got that going, and then possibly spruce it up even further rhythmically by doing something like that. Okay, so now I've added on. So you can see melodically what's happening. So it's sounding, hopefully, to you reasonable as a piece of music. That's the most important thing. Okay, now we need to get that bar in going backwards here. It's a good old brain teaser, this. Where am I going now? Yes. Good. So there we are. We're about to meet in the middle. All right, so we just need to keep checking out, is this working forwards? Is it working backwards? So if we just now, having heard the upper part, see what this bass line is doing. Because of course, apart from the melody going backwards, and you've got to make sure that's going to work, you've also got the rhythm going backwards. So you can get some very peculiar kind of rhythms, like you might have thought in the first bar that was a slightly strange rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. But it's quite distinctive. Yet when it comes back at the end, it's a much more normal rhythm. 1, 2, and 3, 4. Because of course the dotted note and the shorter note have reversed. So it's thinking through how all this stuff works as well. Okay, now I need one more bar here. And all the time you've got to be thinking, how is this going to work when the bass part comes backwards at it? You'll see what I mean in a minute. Because so far so good. In a way, you can write more or less anything to this point, but the next stage becomes really critical because you've got to make sure that whatever you're writing is going to harmonize with the other part when it comes the other way. Okay, so that's that. Let's just get that in here. And then you can see that, again, this is that previous bar on the other part going backwards. By the way, I've started this in the upper part going forwards, but you could start it in the lower part, doesn't matter at all. You can have a crab canon in more than 2 parts if you like, but it's tricky enough in 2 parts, so I wouldn't rush to do it in more than 2 parts at first. Okay, now what we've done so far is in a way the easy bit, but all the time you've got to be thinking, what's going to happen next with this? Because now the fun begins. So far, you can see how that's just worked very simply with this part going forwards. So that's going in that direction. This is the same music going in that direction. But now we've got to carry on with that. Just before we do, let's make sure we're happy with what we've got. So let's just check out this line going forwards. There are probably other things we could do to that, but I think it's got a nice variety of conjunct movement and disjunct movement. We've got a number of interesting rhythmic ideas going because we've got these quavers or these eighth notes. We've got this quite distinctive dotted figure. We've got a slightly longer note to start, which helps because it means we've got a slightly longer note to finish. So you've got to think about things like that. You can see we've got a distinctive leap happening at a sort of midway point. We've got this little bit of arpeggiation at the end with plenty of sort of more stepwise figures going in there. This little 16th note semi-quaver idea, we get it in a couple of times there, so it comes a couple of times here. So there's plenty of variety and melodic shape and design and rhythmic variety. Important if it's going to be a piece of music. Now then, we've now got to think, how is this going to play out when we kind of start fitting things together? So this is where the real fun begins. Okay, now what I'm going to do next is to try and put the first note of the lower part in at the beginning. Now, it's in B flat major, so maybe something that we can do fairly safely is to say, well, what happens if the first note is B flat? The thing is, it also means that the last note is going to be B flat. Now, is that going to work, is your question? Well, actually, we're fairly safe, aren't we? If we start on two B flats and we finish on two B flats, well, we've started and we've finished on the tonic, so that's fair enough. Now, what I'm thinking here is, if the bottom part were to move there, that would be a good thing because we've got a 2-beat note in the upper part, so let's keep the bass moving. So we've got a little bit of rhythmic independence. When one part's moving, the other part doesn't have to move so much. Sometimes they might work in parallel, sometimes they might not. This has now got to work as a bass line, and later on it's got to work as an upper part. Now, one thing that occurs to me here is that we can do this. If we carry on in 6 effectively, do you see what I've done? So we started with the 2 B flats, we've got a passing note or a passing tone, and then we've effectively got these 2 6. Okay, the rhythm is a bit independent, but we've basically got those 6. When that comes out in the wash, it should be all right. What's going to happen, of course, is those intervals are going to invert because we're flicking the parts upside down. So, you know, if we're writing 6, we know that they'll invert to thirds. So thirds and 6 are always consonant, so we're not going to bump into a heap of dissonance we don't like. Having written that first bar, I'm now going to write the last bar, which of course is going to be this bar backwards. You can see how this starts to get interesting. Okay, now then, we need to check that that is working both ways. I think we were fairly happy, weren't we, with the first bar, the first measure, doing this. So before we go any further, we need to check that this last measure, the last bar, is okay with everything flicked up the other way around. Actually, I think we can get away with that. Let's just sort of double check why. When we look in the first measure, we've got an octave, a passing note or a passing tone. We've then got this 6, which is implying a chord 1 in first inversion. And then we've got another 6 implying chord 2 in first inversion. So that's all making sense. When we then look at this last measure, this last bar, well, this could be a chord 2, but it also could be sort of a 5/7 second inversion or something. Then we've kind of got this, but it's associated with that. So kind of third, third. That's because we had 2 6 at the end of the first measure. We invert that in the last measure, we've got 2 thirds. Now then we get an accented passing note or passing tone onto the B flat. So you can see how that's happened. When the C came here, it was an unaccented passing tone or passing note onto this. Because we're now going backwards and we're repositioned, that becomes accented. So you see all these things that happen when you get writing a crab canon. They can kind of put you in a mental asylum if you're not careful writing these things. But, stick with it and you'll find there's a lot to be gained from writing crab canon, actually. And it's quite fun, really. Now, in the next measure here, we're looking at quite a busy upper part. So we could make life a bit easier for ourselves by thinking, well, why not just hang around in the lower part? You can't sort of do this all the time. But how about we just fill up a bar, fill up the whole measure with a sustained F? Because really all this stuff then looks like a chord 5, doesn't it? Accented passing note, harmony note, lower auxiliary or lower neighbour tone, harmony, accented passing note or passing tone, harmony, harmony. So we can justify all the notes. Okay, so that means then when I come down here, all I've got to do is that. Okay, so you see where that's come from now, hopefully. Does it work later on? Seems to work quite well, because when we're looking in this bar, this measure, we're now looking at chord 5 again, aren't we? Which is kind of what we want. We're going to go 5 to 1 at the end, really. So that's a chord 5. Harmony, harmony, unaccented passing, harmony, lower auxiliary or lower neighbour tone, harmony, passing, unaccented, onto the next last measure, last bar. So that's working quite well. You might decide you don't want to have a 4-beat note like that, but taking the other part is busy, you can get away with that. Having been sort of a bit static in that second bar, that second measure, maybe in the next measure we want to kind of get moving a bit. Now I'm thinking about this thing about, remember that 6 and thirds invert, because you're flicking the parts over, all the intervals are going to end up inverting, aren't they? So let's see what happens if we think about thirds and 6. Does it make sense? Does it make sense harmonically? So in this measure, let's do something different from the previous measure by running this sort of in parallel 6, because we know that when we come to deal with the corresponding bar later, those 6 are going to become thirds. Okay, now I map the same rhythm on at that point, but then I'm going to sort of slow the rhythm down in the lower part, because the upper part is now going to get busy. So how about we do that? Okay, now what's going on in that bar then? Well, you can see what we're doing in 6, that's all harmonizing, and it's already around the B flat major chord, and then possibly moving on to a 2 or a 5/7 implied at the end. So that's all right, and all those 6 will invert quite nicely. So before we go any further, you see why I'm suggesting you do this one bar, one measure at a time. Before we go any further, let's map the bar we've just written into the corresponding place in the upper part. So that's going to work, I think. You've always got to be prepared to shuffle things around if they don't work, but we're fairly confident that if we're writing 6, when you invert them and they become thirds, they'll also still work. So you can't write the whole crab canon in thirds and 6, but it's a kind of useful safety net. Okay, let's just now compare that with this. So looking at this bar first, we've got... Okay, now let's look at the corresponding bar down here. It's all coming out quite nicely, actually, isn't it? So that's all right, good. Well, we're well on our way now. We've only got one more bar to do and we're in business. Now we're at the kind of halfway point, so the bass line at the beginning could maybe be a bit more settled. How about if I just carry on writing another third here? We had a load of 6 in the previous bar, the previous measure, but now maybe a compound third. And then we want to kind of maybe settle on the tonic a bit. Now then, let's just see what is now happening in this measure, this bar. Well, that's harmony, upper auxiliary or upper neighbour tone, back to the harmony, accented passing, harmony, and then all of this is spelling out notes of the tonic chord, isn't it? Okay, how is that going to map out in the other part in the next bar? Well, we're going to have the long B flat first, which is quite nice because you've really got 2 4-bar phrases, haven't you? So the idea of it sort of settling on the tonic at the end of that 4th bar, end of that 4th measure, and then starting again on the tonic, but having the long note in the bass for the cadence at the end of bar 4, and then having the long note in the upper part beginning of bar 5 kind of works quite nicely, doesn't it? And then really we said all this was about the tonic chord, and so when I map that out, it should all work, shouldn't it? Okay, let's check this bar out. So this bar here sounds like this. Okay, let's see how we do that here. Yeah, that seems to be working, doesn't it? And we have ourselves one crab canon. So just to recap on that, and then we'll play it again, you can see we've got this part moving forwards and then a second phrase moving forwards like that. But exactly the same music is going the other way in the lower part. So do you see how the crab canon works? There's something about this that really excites me. I'm a sad kind of person who gets excited by things like crab canon. But there we are. It's a very satisfying thing to write if it works. If it doesn't work, it can really drive you insane, as I say. But when it works, there's something remarkable about it. Okay, now, when you've got it, you want to check, well, do the 2 lines make melodic sense? And when you put them together, does it make harmonic sense? So let's just consider this upper part, and we'll go from the beginning to the end and think, are we happy with that melodically? I think it works all right. Let's look at the lower part. Does this work melodically? I think that sort of works, doesn't it? Put them together. This is the complete performance of this crab canon. There we are. If we had more time, we could probably improve on that in various ways. I can already see there are certain things about that that I just might want to refine a little bit. But actually, that's the essentials of a crab canon. That's how it works. And as I say, it's a great fun thing to do. So if you're feeling brave and you've got your canonic skills developing nicely, have a go at writing a crab canon. But I hope what I've explained above all else is a process of doing it. You can see that if you just wrote all of the top line and then thought, well, I hope all that works backwards in the other part, you'll be in a terrible mess. But I just tried to unpack a way of doing it that gives you half a chance of making it buzz, and just thinking through bar by bar, what's the implication of everything you're doing when you're doing it the other way around? Because then if something doesn't work, you can repair it before you move on. But there we are, crab canon. Enjoy. Well, if you have enjoyed this video, you might like to go to our website, www.eclipse.com. www.mmcourses.co.uk. Click on courses and there's a course there on writing counterpoint. So if Canon is something that you're getting quite excited about, you might want to look at that particular course and investigate some skills in writing counterpoint. Lots of people are quite happy writing a melody, putting some chords with it, so they're kind of writing homophonically. If you want to write contrapuntally and really get these lines moving and combining with each other, well, Canon we've been talking about as one way of doing it, but have a look at that counterpoint course and see if it's for you. Lots of other courses there. Have a look at Maestros, have a look at everything else on the home page, but enjoy contrapuntal and canonic writing.